Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take the crucial, often overwhelming stories of our world and distill them into essential knowledge for you.
Hello.
Today, we are opening the file on a story that really defines corporate tragedy and systemic failure.
We're talking about the Bhopal gas tragedy.
Exactly. It's a disaster that still casts a heavy toxic shadow even now, 40 years later.
And we've assembled a pretty comprehensive stack of sources here. They cover the night of December 2nd to 3rd, 1984, a night that's widely and very sadly described as the world's worst industrial disaster.
And our dive today, it isn't just to recount the history.
No, not at all. We really need to examine this complex nexus of technical breakdown, corporate negligence, and that agonizing corporate debate over what actually caused it.
And critically, the long-term costs,
Yeah.
the chronic social and health costs that are still being paid today.
That's the mission, to move past this simple narrative of a single accident and really understand why Bhopal became a chronic disaster, one that, continues to unfold decades later.
So to do that, I think we have to start by confronting the sheer scale of the human toll. It's just staggering.
It is. To establish that horrifying scale, you have to look at the immediate impact. Now, the Indian government officially confirmed 3,787 deaths.
Okay.
But most of our sources agree that credible estimates of the immediate deaths run, well, much higher.
How much higher are we talking?
Some estimates place the immediate loss of life, just in those first few days, at up to 10,000 people.
10,000. And the physical assault on the city, on the people, it was relentless.
The exposure footprint was staggering. I mean, think about it. Over 500,000 people, more than 500,000 residents were exposed to that invisible, toxic cloud as it just settled low over the city.
And it wasn't just an acute disaster, a one-night event. The sources make that very clear.
Absolutely not. They document these catastrophic long-term effects. Premature deaths reported in just the 2 decades after the incident. Well, they range between 15,000 and 20,000 people.
15 to 20,000.
That's why we have to understand Bhopal as a chronic catastrophe. It's not just some historical event you can put in a textbook.
So in those first few hours,
Yeah.
what was killing people so brutally? The sources describe the medical causes of death, and they are terrifying.
The primary mechanisms of mortality involved the chemical literally suffocating its victims. You're talking about choking, a massive fluid buildup in the lungs, which is called pulmonary edema.
So drowning on dry land.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
And a rapid shutdown of the circulatory system, something called reflexogenic circulatory collapse.
And the autopsies. They painted an even more gruesome picture.
Oh, they did. A picture of just systemic failure across the victims' bodies. They showed cerebral edema, so brain swelling, kidney tubular necrosis, fatty degeneration of the liver, and necrotizing enteritis, which is basically tissue death in the intestines. It was a comprehensive chemical assault leading to a rapid systemic organ shutdown.
And the substance at the core of all of this was methyl isocyanate, MIC. It sounds like complex jargon, but I think to understand the depth of this failure, we have to unpack what this chemical actually is, why it demands such extreme respect and such rigid safety protocols.
Well, MIC is highly volatile, which means it evaporates very easily. It's a colorless liquid with a really sharp, pungent odor.
And at the plant, the Union Carbide India Limited plant, or UCIL, its job was to, make pesticide?
Exactly. It was a chemical intermediate. It was essential for synthesizing a very popular pesticide called carbaryl, which was sold under the brand name 7.
And the toxicity profile for MIC is, it seems intense, even for an industrial chemical.
Oh, it's extreme. Both the liquid and the vapor are incredibly toxic if you inhale them and digest them or even just get them on your skin. But its danger isn't just biological, it's about its chemical stability, or rather, its lack of it.
Right, and this seems to be the critical point.
It is. The core technical danger of MIC is its violent instability. It reacts ectothermically.
Which means it generates a lot of heat.
A significant amount of heat, yes. And it does this when it comes into contact with water. This reaction leads to this rapid self-polymerization, where the molecules all link up.
Okay.
And that process, driven by all that heat, causes an uncontrollable pressure buildup inside whatever vessel is holding it.
So if water gets in, you don't just have a contamination, you have a chemical runaway reaction that can rapidly escalate into a gas explosion.
Precisely. Which is why the safe storage protocols were, or at least should have been, incredibly strict.
So what were they? What was the procedure?
MIC had to be held strictly under an inert nitrogen pressure, specifically between 0.35 and 0.69 bar, just to keep it isolated from any contaminants in the atmosphere.
And it had to be kept cold.
Intensely cold. Between -10 degrees Celsius and 0 degrees Celsius, that temperature range was vital for maintaining a low vapor pressure and stopping that runaway reaction from ever getting started.
So you've laid it out. Extreme cold, inert pressure, and a zero tolerance for water. It sounds almost impossible to store safely without just rigorous constant control.
It requires it.
Which brings us to, I guess, section 2. The catastrophic chain reaction that systematically disabled every single one of those safeguards.
The UCIL facility was established back in 1969. But by the early 80s, the global market for pesticides, especially 7, it had started to decline.
So demand was falling.
Right. This drop in demand caused the company to drastically slow production. They even put the plant up for sale. And this led to an accumulation of unused MIC inventory.
So they just had this poison sitting there.
In 3 massive underground tanks, each one designed to hold 68,000 liters.
And what our sources reveal is that this disaster, it wasn't a sudden event, was it? It was more like a slow motion accident, set up months, if not years earlier, just waiting for a trigger.
That's a very good way to put it. There were 3 critical preconditions, and all of them really stemmed from systemic neglect.
Okay, let's break them down. What was the first one?
First, the specific tank that failed, tank E610, was dangerously overfilled. It held 42 tons of liquid MIC.
And what was the safety limit?
The specified safety limit mandated that the tanks should hold no more than 50% of their capacity. This one was way over.
Overfilling is a huge hazard in chemical processing. It reduces that necessary safety buffer, the headspace, for any vapor buildup or reaction expansion.
That's absolutely right. And secondly, and this is perhaps the most fateful failure, in late October 1984.
So just over a month before the leak.
Exactly. Tank E610 lost its ability to contain its inert nitrogen pressure seal.
So that first line of defense was gone.
It was. And that failure meant 2 things. 1, they couldn't safely transfer the volatile MIC out of that tank into a safer one. And 2, more dangerously, the broken seal meant external contaminants, air, moisture could now potentially get into the tank.
Okay, wait. If they knew the nitrogen seal was broken, which prevented a safe transfer and allowed contaminants in, why wasn't the tank immediately emptied? Or the whole operation just shut down? I mean, that single decision point seems to indicate a high degree of operational negligence.
It does. And it connects directly to the third precondition, the decision to cut the vital refrigeration system.
The system meant to keep it intensely cold.
The very one. The refrigeration, which was necessary to keep the MIC below 0 degrees Celsius, had been shut down back in January of 1982.
2 years earlier.
To cut operational costs.
Yeah.
The Freon coolant was actually physically removed in June of 1984.
So just to be clear, they had a highly unstable chemical which needs to be kept below freezing, and they were storing it at ambient temperatures.
Which could reach up to 40 degrees Celsius during the day in Bhopal.
All because they wanted to save money on the power bill.
That's the reality of it.
Yeah.
The MIC was stored far, far above the manual's advised 4.5 degrees Celsius limit. So you combine the overfilled tank, the failed pressure seal, and the high ambient temperature. The system was already dangerously unstable. It was highly susceptible to any minor contamination.
So the stage is set. The actual event timeline begins late on December 2nd. The accepted trigger after all these months of instability was water. How did water get into a tank that should have been sealed under pressure?
Well, it's widely accepted that the water entered tank E610 through a side pipe. Workers were trying to unclog a pipe that connected to the tank's network.
So routine maintenance.
Supposedly. And the water they used in this cleaning process, it backflowed. Once that water got into the tank, the rapid exothermic reaction began.
The runaway reaction.
And it was further accelerated by contaminants, specifically corroding iron that had flaked off from non-stainless steel pipes inside the storage unit. That iron acted as a catalyst.
And this is where the story shifts from, systemic failure to active human denial, because workers actually noticed the problem, but they dismissed the warning signs.
That's the terrifying human element in this timeline. Between 10:30 p.m. and 11 p.m. on December 2nd, the tank pressure started to rise significantly.
How much?
It went from a stable 14 kilopascals to a very worrying 70 kilopascals.
That's a 5-fold increase.
Right. Multiple senior employees were alerted, but they just assumed the gauge was malfunctioning.
Why would they assume that?
Because it had been. A failure had been noted on and off for about a week prior. So they actively ignored a sharp, real-time warning.
The cognitive dissonance required to ignore a gauge spiking like that is it's astounding. What does that one decision tell you about the working culture at that plant?
It tells you the safety culture had completely collapsed. Workers were just accustomed to faulty equipment. They were under pressure to keep the plant running, despite all these known defects. This normalization of deviance meant the critical signs of a runaway reaction were initially dismissed as just another faulty gauge.
And the escalation after that initial denial was terrifyingly fast.
Once the heat started to build, the reaction just became unstoppable. Within minutes of that pressure reading being dismissed, the reaction went critical. By 12:40 a.m., the temperature gauge went completely off the scale.
What does that mean, off the scale?
It means it went beyond its maximum reading of 25 degrees Celsius. And at the same time, the internal pressure spiked violently to 280 kilopascals. That's nearly 4 times the nominal limit.
That pressure must have been immense.
It was. The pressure buildup was so catastrophic that the sources mention the concrete slab above the tank actually cracked and lifted,
A concrete crack.
just as the emergency relief valve burst open. And that allowed roughly 30 tons of toxic gas, half the tank's contents, to vent directly into the atmosphere in less than an hour.
30 tons of a highly toxic, highly volatile gas released directly over a densely populated city. And the horror of it all is just amplified by the fact that every single safety layer designed to stop this leak fail at the same time. It was a complete cascade of catastrophe.
Indeed. There were 3 mandatory mitigation systems, and all of them were crippled. First, you had the vent gas scrubber, the VGS.
And its job was to, what, neutralize the gas?
To neutralize the toxic gas using caustic soda, sodium hydroxide, before it could escape. But it was deactivated. It was in standby mode.
So it's just turned off.
But even if it had been running, multiple sources indicate it was insufficiently sized, and it lacked the required amount of caustic soda solution to neutralize a leak of this magnitude anyway.
So a total failure. Then you have layer 2, the flare tower. It's supposed to burn off escaping gas. Also useless.
The flare tower was disconnected for maintenance. And what's more, even if it had been operational, design reports showed it was improperly sized. It could only handle, at maximum capacity, about a quarter of the volume of gas that was released from tank E610 in that short time.
And the final layer, the water curtains. These were meant to spray a deluge of water to physically contain the gas.
They were essentially window dressing. The deluge guns in place had insufficient water pressure to be effective, and crucially, they were only 10 meters high.
How high was the gas being released?
From the emergency valve stack, 30 meters high. So the gases just bypassed the curtains entirely. They rose up into the atmosphere before being carried away by the wind.
The final, just brutal detail of operational failure goes right back to the very mechanism that triggered the event. The pipes they were cleaning.
Right.
The physical barriers designed to prevent water from backflowing were just...
The sources confirm this. They're called slip-line plates. They're basically physical steel barriers that you insert into pipes to prevent exactly this kind of thing, cleaning water accidentally leaking into the MIC tanks.
And they weren't installed.
They were not installed. Their installation had been deliberately omitted from the cleaning checklist. It was just poor operational procedure. So you had a failure of maintenance, a failure of procedure, a failure of design, and a failure of oversight all bundled together.
As this gas, which is denser than air, settled close to the ground and blew southeast over the city, the human crisis began. And this brings us to a really crucial part of the immediate aftermath, this deadly debate over the gas cloud's composition and the specific type of poisoning.
The initial cloud, yes, it contained methyl isocyanate and some degradation products like chloroform and methylene. But what really stands out in the forensic investigation is the evidence suggesting the gas turned into something far deadlier because of the intense temperature inside that reacting tank.
A temperature that, as you mentioned, peaked at an astounding 200 degrees Celsius.
Exactly. And when MIC is exposed to that level of thermal degradation, it breaks down into highly deadly products, specifically hydrogen cyanide, HCN.
Cyanide.
And this is critical because autopsies conducted on the victims revealed their blood had turned a characteristic cherry red.
Which is the classic sign.
It is the classic undeniable sign of hydrogen cyanide poisoning. HCN kills by preventing your body's cells from using oxygen.
But the company, Union Carbide, they consistently denied the presence of hydrogen cyanide. So what was the devastating consequence of that denial for the victims?
That denial created a fatal delay in administering the correct antidote.
There was an antidote.
There was. Sodium thiosulfate, or NATS. It's highly effective against cyanide poisoning because it reacts with the cyanide to form thiocyanate, which is biologically harmless and could be quickly excreted in urine.
So the doctors on the ground were fighting blind. They had no idea they were treating cyanide poisoning.
They were completely in the dark. Hospital staff were first told the leak was ammonia, then phosgene, and then finally just MI, which most of them had never even heard of or understood its degradation products.
But eventually, they did use the antidote.
A clinical trial was eventually conducted during the tragedy using gnats, and the patients who received the drug showed immediate improvements in their respiratory and neurological symptoms. The chemical evidence was confirmed by increased thiocyanate levels in their urine.
So the sources show the antidote worked, but by the time it was administered for many, it was just too late.
That's the tragedy of it. This therapy would have been most effective if it had been given immediately after exposure. The denial and the subsequent delays, they severely limited the benefits, and they likely cost thousands of lives that might have been saved in those critical hours following the leak.
The lack of timely, accurate information from UCIL to the Bhopal authorities wasn't a minor oversight.
It was a profound failure of emergency response planning, weaponized by corporate denial.
Okay, let's move to Section 3. This is where we've had to delve into the core question of culpability. Was this an accumulation of errors due to corporate negligence, or, as the company claimed, an act of intentional sabotage?
The overwhelming consensus, and this is supported by multiple government inquiries and independent investigations, points squarely to corporate negligence.
Okay.
The disaster stemmed from a dangerous combination of severe underinvestment, decaying facilities, and just poor governance, all driven by cost-cutting measures. The factors are, well, they're entirely systemic.
Let's start with the cuts. Underinvestment, creating that dangerous environment. What were the specific financial decisions that actively degraded the safety infrastructure?
Management attempted to reduce expenses by implementing about $1.25 million worth of cuts. And these weren't minor trims. They gutted safety resources. For instance, manpower in safety and maintenance was drastically reduced. Safety training for new operators was slashed from a comprehensive 6-month period down to a completely insufficient 15 days.
A 6-month specialized training reduced to 2 weeks for handling one of the world's most dangerous industrial chemicals. That's just incomprehensible.
It speaks to the prioritization of cost over competence. There was a demonstrable lack of skilled, experienced operators because the most knowledgeable workers had left. They left due to low morale and the lack of investment.
And there was a language barrier, too.
A huge one. Compounding all of this, instructions and safety procedures were issued only in English, even though the vast majority of the local workers spoke Hindi. This created a profound communication barrier in a high-hazard environment.
And our sources indicate that this degradation, this decay, was known. It was noted internally by the parent company, Union Carbide Corporation, UCC. They just failed to heed their own warnings.
Yes. In May of 1982, UCC conducted a safety audit, and it was damning.
What did it find?
It identified 61 distinct hazards in the phosgene and MIC units. It classified 30 of them as major concerns. The audit explicitly warned of substandard worker performance, poor maintenance practices, and it listed 10 major threats to the plant's operational safety.
So what happened? Did they fix them?
UCIL prepared a sort of superficial action plan, but UCC failed to send a follow-up team to confirm that those conditions were ever permanently corrected. And by 1984, conditions had deteriorated rapidly again.
And most alarmingly, there was a direct external warning that should have sounded every alarm bell about the potential for this exact type of runaway MIC reaction.
This is perhaps the most criminal failure of due diligence. In September 1984.
Just a few months before the disaster.
Right. UCC produced an internal report focused on their similarly designed facility in West Virginia in the U.S. That report specifically warned of the potential for a catastrophic failure due to a runaway MIC reaction in the storage tanks.
The exact thing that happened in Bhopal.
The exact thing. But that crucial warning was never forwarded, never translated, and never applied to the Bhopal plant, despite the identical core design flaw being flagged.
That just suggests a massive management gap, a failure to enforce universal safety standards across their international operations. It's like they were treating the Indian plant as an acceptable risk.
That's the consensus conclusion of most of the independent inquiries, yes. However, we do have to impartially present the conflicting narrative, the one maintained by UCC and its successor, Dow Chemical.
And that is the claim of employee sabotage.
Correct.
So what exactly is the worker sabotage argument?
UCC's position is that the accident was not due to systemic failures at all, but was the result of a single, disgruntled employee who secretly and deliberately connected a small water hose directly to the MIC tank.
To spoil its contents.
The spoil its contents, exactly. This employee then fled, according to the corporate narrative.
And UCC even commissioned a report, the Arthur D. Little report, to provide some technical backing for this counter-narrative. What specific technical evidence did that report raise to dispute the negligence theory?
The Arthur D. Little report argued that the backflow of cleaning water, which is central to the negligence theory, was physically impossible for a couple of tangible reasons.
Okay.
First, they claimed the small water pipes used by workers nearby were only half an inch in diameter, and they lacked the necessary hydraulic pressure to force water 10 feet vertically up into the MIC tank, which should have been pressurized, even if that seal was compromised.
So mechanically, they're arguing the water couldn't have just accidentally flowed in due to gravity or low pressure.
Precisely. And secondly, and this is important for the forensic evidence, the report claimed that if the backflow had occurred through the standard pipe network, which was a system involving large 6 to 8 inch pipes, then those pipes should have contained residual water when they were investigated later.
And did they?
The UCC report claimed that those pipes were found bone dry when they were examined in 1985, which suggested that water must have entered through some unconventional, deliberately connected source.
That does offer a strong, if, self-serving technical counter-argument. What was the legal framework around this? Did the Indian government investigate this theory?
UCC stressed that the Indian government ultimately refused to pursue the rogue employee theory. They focused their legal efforts only on attaching blame and liability to the corporation itself.
Which highlights a deep political and legal tension.
It does. A tension over who should carry the primary blame, the corporation for negligence, the local authorities for failing to enforce safety, or an individual worker. And regardless, the victims were caught in the middle.
Whether it was malice or incompetence, the tragic consequences are undeniable and they continue to this day. And that brings us to Section 4, the enduring shadow. This is where we confront the reality that the disaster is still claiming victims through chronic morbidity decades later.
This is the dark legacy you mentioned at the start. The sources reveal a profound systemic health crisis affecting hundreds of thousands of survivors. The core problem lies in the irreversible damage caused by MIC-induced. Well, the technical term is carbamylation.
Okay, let's slow down and explain that. Carbamylation, it's complex, but understanding it seems essential to understanding the chronic suffering.
It sounds technical, but you can think of it this way.
Yeah.
The MIC didn't just burn the cells. It chemically rewrote the fundamental blueprints of your body's proteins.
It rewrote them.
It attaches something called a carbamyl group to proteins and tissues. And this chemical rewriting permanently scrambled key biological functions.
Can you give an example?
Sure. It permanently altered crucial proteins like hemoglobin, which severely impaired the blood's ability to transport oxygen efficiently. And it permanently impacted glutathione, a critical antioxidant, which effectively neutralized the body's ability to fight inflammation and oxidative stress.
So the exposure caused permanent molecular damage, and that resulted in systemic long-term ailments across multiple, seemingly unconnected organ systems.
Exactly.
What are the most common long-term ailments that survivors face?
They endure a whole host of chronic respiratory problems. Persistent chronic asthma, aggravation of existing tuberculosis, and both obstructive and restrictive lung diseases.
Meaning they struggle both to breathe air out and to draw full breath in.
That's right. Ocular damage is rampant. Reduced vision, chronic conjunctivitis, corneal opacities, and early cataracts developing in people far, far younger than normal.
And the sources also detail extensive neurological and psychological fallout. It suggests the brain and the nervous system were also permanent targets.
That's correct. The acute phase brought neuroses and anxiety, but the chronic effects include widespread diagnoses of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder,
Of course.
and also severe depression, impaired cognitive function, specifically poor audio and visual memory, and reduced motor speed and precision decades later.
And the reproductive health issues documented they're truly staggering. It points to a permanent alteration of the population's biological future.
The long-term reproductive health risks are severe.
Mm-hmm.
Women survivors report alarmingly high rates of gynecological disorders. They also have a significantly increased rate of spontaneous abortions.
Miscarriages.
The miscarriage rate is reported as 7 times the national average.
7 times.
Furthermore, there is impaired fetal development in those who do carry to term. And disturbingly, one source indicates that the rate of uterus cancer in Bhopal is now the highest in all of India. This is a community where fundamental biological processes have been permanently damaged.
This suggests the disaster scope is far wider and deeper than just the immediate affected zone. And recent research confirms this, right? The geographic zone of impact was exponentially larger than anyone initially recognized.
This is a vital modern insight that rewrites the history of the disaster. Initial studies, they typically focus very narrowly on the area within about 4.5 kilometers of the plant.
Yeah.
But new epidemiological research, using a robust statistical technique, suggests the disaster affected people across a substantially wider area.
How wide?
Up to 100 kilometers from the UCIL plant. That's roughly 60 miles.
That's astonishing. It means that the 500,000 exposed number is likely a severe underestimation. It drastically increases the total population affected by this chronic health crisis.
It does. And the most chilling finding relates to those who were exposed in utero.
The children in the womb on the night of the disaster.
Indeed. The 1985 birth cohort, they've exhibited profound long-term harm. The research isolated men in that cohort who were exposed in utero and were still living within 100 kilometers of Bhopal.
And what did it find?
It found they showed a 6.2 percentage point higher cancer risk 30 years later.
Okay, 6.2 percentage points higher. For our listener, what does that actually represent in terms of relative risk?
When you compare them to a control group of men born shortly before or after the tragedy, but outside the exposure zone, that 6.2 percentage point difference represents a shocking 27-fold higher risk of cancer for that specific cohort.
27 times higher.
It demonstrates that the chemical exposure created a permanent intergenerational health liability.
And the cost isn't just medical bills and suffering. It has fundamentally crippled the human capital of an entire generation in that zone.
Absolutely. The data shows significant socioeconomic costs. The same group of men exposed in utero were more likely by 1 to 2 percentage points to report an employment disability as adults. And, crucially, they also had lower educational attainment. The disaster didn't just kill people. It compromised the ability of survivors to learn, to earn a living, and to contribute to society decades into the future.
So 40 years later, the disaster is still casting a shadow that has been passed down through their bodies and their economic prospects. Let's shift our focus in Section 5 to the environmental and legal legacies. This really demonstrates the perpetual nature of this disaster.
The crisis didn't stop when the gas cloud dispersed. It evolved from an atmospheric leak into a catastrophic groundwater contamination.
Because the factory was just abandoned.
It was. It closed in 1986, and the UCIL site was simply left. While pipes and some equipment were salvaged, highly toxic chemical residues and storages remained. And the area had historically been used as an indiscriminate dumping ground for hazardous chemicals for years.
So this wasn't just old rubble. It was an active chemical time bomb leaking into the environment. What specific dangerous pollutants were found seeping into the local ecosystem?
Well, multiple studies conducted since 1989 have revealed severe soil and groundwater contamination extending up to 3 kilometers from the plant.
And what was in the water?
A cocktail of pollutants. It included highly toxic heavy metals. We're talking mercury, lead, chromium, nickel, copper, alongside toxic organochlorines and dangerous volatile organic compounds.
We have some truly shocking contamination figures in the sources that highlight the immediate danger to residents who are relying on local well water.
The data is alarming. Water samples from local wells showed carbon tetrachloride, which is a known carcinogen, at 1,000 times the maximum limit recommended by the World Health Organization.
1,000 times.
And another, trichloroethylene, which is known to impair fetal development and cause neurological damage, was found at 50 times the safety limits set by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. These are astronomical figures.
And given the plant's proximity to densely populated areas, this contamination must have infiltrated the entire local food supply chain.
It did. The contamination went beyond soil and water. The sources confirmed that pollutants were found in local fruit and vegetables grown nearby.
And most critically,
the toxins were detected in the breast milk of nursing women living near the contaminated area. This proves that the chemical legacy infiltrated the most intimate biological processes of the community. It made it an inescapable health hazard.
it's just hard to reconcile the idea that this level of toxic waste has remained on site for 4 decades.
The longevity of this environmental challenge is extraordinary. It took until the 2024-2025 operation, 40 years after the leak for authorities, to finally transport 377 tons of the remaining hazardous waste.
And even that was a major operation.
A huge one. This waste had to be moved via a specialized green corridor, under tight security to a remote, specialized facility for incineration. It just illustrates the political and logistical complexity of even cleaning up the residual mess.
This long, drawn-out environmental cleanup, it contrasts so sharply with the swift but highly controversial legal and financial reckoning that took place.
The primary financial restitution was finalized in 1989. In an out-of-court settlement mediated by the Indian Supreme Court, Union Carbide agreed to pay $470 million for damages.
And that was paid directly to the Indian government.
Correct.
Now, UCC argued this was a sufficient settlement. They noted it far exceeded what Indian law required at the time, but critics, they argued the figure was grossly insufficient.
Hugely insufficient.
Yeah.
Especially when you compare it to U.S. legal precedents for industrial liability.
How does it compare?
When you juxtapose it against U.S. case law, particularly the theoretical liability based on U.S. asbestos cases, where Union Carbide had significant involvement, the liability for Bhopal was estimated to potentially exceed $10 billion.
$10 billion versus $470 million.
Right. And that $470 million figure, when you break it down, meant the average payout for a family who lost a loved one was only about $2,200.
$2,000.
The stark disparity, it just underscores the perception that a lower value was placed on the lives lost in Bhopal compared to similar tragedies in Western industrialized nations.
And attempts by victims to seek more comprehensive justice through American courts were repeatedly blocked. It forced the justice system to remain within the jurisdiction that had failed to protect them in the first place.
That's right. Litigation dragged on for years. The U.S. Supreme Court ultimately refused to hear the victims' claims for damages in a U.S. court in 1993.
On what grounds?
They essentially ruled that UCIL was a separate and independent legal entity, and this decision forced all subsequent litigation into the Indian jurisdiction.
And the criminal justice outcome was also very limited.
It was. In 2010, 7 former UCIL employees were convicted in Bhopal of causing death by negligence. They received only a 2-year imprisonment sentence, which was the maximum allowed by Indian law for that specific charge.
The limited legal accountability, the grossly inadequate financial settlement, the ongoing contamination, it paints a picture of corporate structures successfully shielding themselves from the long-term cost of environmental and social catastrophe.
It does.
Which naturally leads us to our final section, the global lessons learned from Bhopal and how it catalyzed a major evolution in industrial safety.
Bhopal served as the essential, albeit horrific, global wake-up call for the chemical industry. The key lesson was recognizing that reliance solely on technical systems just wasn't enough. Organizational, procedural, and human factors were just as critical, if not more so, in accident prevention.
And the incident directly led to a fundamental restructuring of safety philosophy in the United States, creating the modern concept of process safety.
This is a direct consequence of Bhopal. It led to the adoption of formal process safety standards in the U.S., notably the OSHA Process Safety Management Standard, or PSM, and the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990. These mandates required a holistic, systematic approach to high-hazard processes.
So what are the key elements of that PSM structure that Bhopal made mandatory, and how would they have directly addressed the failures we've been talking about?
Well, the PSM standard is mandatory for any facility handling highly hazardous chemicals. It mandates comprehensive elements. First, something called process hazard analysis, or PHA.
And what does that do?
It requires companies to proactively identify, evaluate, and control hazards associated with their processes. Had a thorough PHA been done in Bhopal, it would have immediately flagged the design flaw that allowed the water cleaning line to connect to the MIC tanks as a catastrophic risk, regardless of whether a valve failed or not.
So that would have been the first layer of prevention that was entirely missed.
Exactly. Secondly, pre-startup safety reviews, or PSSR. This ensures that any new or modified equipment aligns with design specs, and crucially, that procedures are in place before you start operating.
And how would that have helped in Bhopal?
A PSSR would have stopped the Bhopal plant immediately when the refrigeration unit was shut off because it would no longer meet the original design safety parameters.
And finally, written procedures.
PSM requires written operating procedures covering all phases of operation. This ensures workers know exactly how to handle equipment and emergencies. It would have addressed the confusion of the English-only manuals and those flawed cleaning checklists.
The other profound failure in Bhopal was the information vacuum. Local residents, emergency responders, they had no idea what the danger was. How did the regulatory landscape fix that dangerous information gap?
That was addressed by the passage of the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act, EPCRA, in 1986.
Another direct response.
A direct legislative response to Bhopal and another toxic leak at the UCC plant in West Virginia. EPCRA mandated that plants report their hazardous chemical inventories to local authorities, and crucially, that they immediately notify local emergency planning committees of any significant chemical releases.
So the public and first responders are never caught blind again.
That's the goal.
Beyond new rules, there was also a fundamental shift in engineering philosophy, a move away from mitigation like the broken scrubbers and flares, towards something called inherent safety principles.
The concept of inherent safety is philosophical as much as it is technical. Instead of relying on expensive, complex, or easily disabled safety systems, you design the process to be fundamentally safer from the start. You eliminate the hazard rather than just trying to manage it.
So let's look at the four main principles of inherent safety and apply them to the Bhopal scenario.
Okay. First is moderate. This means reducing the strength of the hazard. In Bhopal, this would have meant storing the MIC in several smaller tanks spread across the site, rather than in two large, concentrated 68,000-liter vessels. That would reduce the total volume available for a runaway reaction.
It also applies to separating the hazardous location from residential areas, a rule that was clearly ignored in Bhopal's zoning.
It was. Second is substitute.
Which means
Substitution means using safer raw materials or intermediates entirely. And this is key. The pesticide carbaryl, 7, can be produced without directly storing large amounts of MIC.
Really?
Yes. Other manufacturers at the time used alternative chemical pathways to produce the same final product. It was at a greater manufacturing cost, but it was possible. Had UCL substituted away from high-volume MIC storage, the core risk would have been entirely eliminated.
And the final two principles focus on design simplification.
They do. Simplify means eliminating unnecessary complexity to reduce the risk of human or mechanical error. The complex system at Bhopal that connected the water cleaning pipes to the MIC tanks was an unnecessary complexity. And the final principle is minimize, which overlaps with moderate. It just focuses on keeping chemical inventory as low as possible. If they hadn't been storing 42 tons of product because sales were falling, the crisis would have been smaller.
That reliance on a complex, energy-consuming system, the refrigeration that was shut off just to save 18% on power costs, it highlights the core contradiction, doesn't it? The tension between corporate cost-cutting and human safety that allowed the disaster to happen.
And the sources reveal a critical governing dilemma that plagues industrialization globally. The local government was extremely hesitant to enforce stronger safety and pollution standards on UCIL.
Why?
Because they feared losing the plant. It was a major employer, a symbol of integration into the global economy. This prioritization of short-term economic benefit over robust, long-term public health standards just exacerbated the governance challenges that led to the accident.
So it seems Bhopal is not merely a historical industrial accident. It's a profound case study in the chronic disaster that results when political and corporate governance fails to apply universal safety standards to a hazardous industry.
Absolutely. That failure of priorities, economic growth over basic public health, is an unheeded warning that continues to play out today in various rapidly industrializing nations around the world. The corporate structure allowed UCC to operate a risky design in a place where regulatory enforcement was weak, and then retreat from the long-term environmental and health liabilities.
So after all of this, what does this all mean for us now, 40 years later? What is the single most compelling takeaway for you as a learner going through these sources?
I think the most shocking realization from this deep dive is just how the scope of this chronic disaster was so geographically far wider, affecting people up to 100 kilometers away, and chronologically far longer, creating a permanent intergenerational health crisis impacting cancer rates and human capital. We've moved from understanding it as an acute tragedy in one city to recognizing it as a systemic, permanent injury to a massive regional population.
And while global regulations dramatically improved in the wake of Bhopal, that crucial underlying failure of governance where local authorities were afraid to enforce safety standards for fear of economic loss, that remains a powerful and present challenge globally.
The fact that the original UCIL plant was built on land zoned only for light industrial use, meaning the surrounding areas were quickly populated, and that a U.S. court ultimately ruled that site remediation responsibility lay with the financially limited Indian government, not the vastly more wealthy UCC. It perfectly illustrates how this system allows hazards to be created and then disclaimed.
Our sources make it clear that the expansion of the plant led to people building homes right up to the perimeter wall. It created a disaster just waiting to happen. Given the documented resistance to enforcing safety and pollution standards due to economic pressure, we want to leave you with this final provocative thought.
What specific actionable steps can individuals, global financial organizations, and international governance bodies take to break the cycle where economic integration and growth are perpetually prioritized over robust, basic public health and safety? How do we ensure that the next wave of industrial development doesn't create the next chronic intergenerational disaster?
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the dark legacy of Bhopal. We'll see you next time.